Hello, welcome to Musing Heavy, the site devoted to alternative reflections on hard rock and heavy metal. My name is Stephen Meyer, and we're going to wrap up my series entitled The Underrated Fallacy. And if you've checked out other parts of this series, and if you have, thank you very much, you'll know that my central message has been, no matter how much we might like a heavy band, or no matter how much we might think that band deserves a wider audience, right? Most heavy bands are rated appropriately, i.e., they're not underrated. Okay. And so I'm going to wrap things up in this last part and also describe circumstances when, in fact, the band actually is underrated. So I do believe there are times when that is, in fact, the case. All right. So let's check this out and wrap things up a little bit. So part 7. Is any artist underrated? A few final words. Okay, so just putting this in a wider context again. As a young hard rocker metal guy, growing up in the 70s and 80s, so I've been around a little while, I spent a lot of time thinking about why certain artists appealed to some and not others, all right? It actually puzzled me why I disliked pretty much anything that was played on the radio, still kind of do, I guess, aside from some certain satellite channels, even though it was clear that the audiences for pop, R&B, disco, dance music, soft rock, country, on and on it goes. It was very clear to me, though, that the audiences were massive. A lot of people like this stuff, at least at certain points in time, right? It was also weird to me why more people did not appreciate what I considered incredible sounds from really substantial bands, at least in my opinion, right? Especially those that still had generous doses of melody, which I thought everybody would like. So again, King's X, probably the prototypical example. Talked about King's X quite a bit in earlier parts of the paper. But I thought such artists must surely be underrated. Why doesn't King's X have as big an audience as the Bee Gees, for instance? Why? Why is that? Okay. They're underrated. That's why. Not really. At the other end of the spectrum, the listenership associated with more brutal forms of metal was equally perplexing. It did not shock me, though, that I was the only one I personally knew who liked, say, the first Venom album, or liked the first Voivod album, or liked the one and only Hellhammer album, right? And I got to admit, at times I even wondered why I did, given how extreme this stuff was at the time and still kind of is even by today's standards. But I actually was very surprised to learn that there was a substantial upsurge of support for such works from the metal underground. I didn't, at the time, as a younger guy, I didn't really realize how substantial the metal underground was. And it was made up of fringe listeners just like me, situated all around the world. So even though I didn't personally know them, they were out there, right? And eventually, these types of bands were cited as crucial pillars in the development of key subgenres, such as death and black metal, right? Who knew that bands like Venom and Hellhammer were going to spawn all these other bands and create actual subgenres? But it did happen. And then these bands became increasingly revered and perhaps underrated from some perspectives, right? But then another way of looking at this, given the extreme nature of the music of Venom and Voivod and et cetera at the time, and the delivery of these bands, and since the majority of the world quite understandably just hears this as noise, I'm sorry, Steve, Welcome to Hell just sounds like noise. That's all I'm hearing, right? I understand that. I would get why most people would say that. Well, could a case be made that these acts are actually somehow overrated? So never mind an underrated tag, are they actually overrated? In other words, it might be astonishing to many that even a fringe audience exists, right? I mean, I'm sure most people in the mainstream would say, I can't believe anybody would listen to Hellhammer. And the fact that they actually do have a following, well, ain't that something, right? So they're kind of overrated, if anything. Well, eventually I just stopped wondering, right? Sure, I was always content to point out what I considered to be the best albums in a given band's discography, and I'm still happy to do that if anybody asks me or wants to discuss it, it's always fun to talk about. But I found that such terms as underrated or overrated really have little meaning if not put in proper context. And I guess, in this series, I've been trying to do that. So every group I've mentioned so far in this paper, again, a few of them such as Budgie, Pentagram, Captain Beyond, Exodus, Obituary, Incantation, or Mark 7 Deep Purple, and we mentioned a few others too. All of these bands have been given or will be provided with the opportunity for appropriate listenership. Okay, that's kind of key. I'm going to say it again. Have been given or will be provided with the opportunity for appropriate listenership, right? That's in a nutshell why I don't think any of them are underrated. For example, if once again using the typology developed in the earlier parts of the paper, a class 4 heavy metal fan, so somebody who's very niche oriented and only likes specific types of heavy metal, say, right? Let's say they have specific interest in death metal. Well, they either will be familiar with, say, for example, Morbid Angel or Immolation, or inevitably they're going to come to know about these groups at some point in time if they stay interested in death metal, right? In another scenario, take a class 5 heavy fan. That's a heavy fan that tends to enjoy all subgenres of heavy music and eras, etc., right? So take a class 5 heavy fan. They almost certainly are going to know about Budgie's foundational importance to heavy music, or they're probably also going to know about the songwriting styles of King's X, right? And even if this is not the case for, say, a specific type of heavy fan, it is only a matter of time before someone or some media source clues them in. Of course, as long as they stay engaged in exploring heavy metal or hard rock, right? I would argue that this is the situation for most heavy artists that have achieved at least some level of recognition. The reasonable chance for listenership has essentially been built in. Okay, they're not underrated. It's all their audience has been built in already or will be built in, right? Yet, this does not mean that people have to like the music once they've encountered it, right? And in some ways, that's the heart of this underrated fallacy. It really makes no sense to say that King's X is underrated because more people should like them, right? The appropriate pool of hard rock and heavy metal folks have had or will have the chance to enjoy their art, okay? And if they like it, they like it. If they don't, they don't, okay? Moreover, the more mainstream fan, say a class 1 or class 2 fan that we defined earlier, will may never be exposed to Budgie. They might never hear of King's X or Mark 7 Deep Purple, and they certainly are not likely to be exposed to Incantation, an extreme death metal band. But it wouldn't matter, right? This is not the type of music or the era of songs that they are seeking. Class 1 or class 2 fans, they only care about the hits and they're not really interested in heavy bands per se, right? Okay. Plainly, these are not appropriate audiences to even try to track here. So even if something as uncompromisingly heavy as Black Sabbath's War Pigs actually is enjoyed by a wide range of class 2 fans and maybe even the odd class 1 fan, that's a fluke, not a model, right? The fact that Black's, as heavy as they are, actually has some songs that does get played on classic rock radio, that's not really the norm. That's unusual, okay? All right, so you might ask, which artists then actually are underrated? Is nobody underrated? No, actually, I don't think that's true. In my view, any music that never gets the opportunity to be heard by appropriate audiences may be underrated. That's the key. I say may because once given apt exposure, the art does not necessarily have to be good enough to garner admiration, right? So, just thinking of some examples, that local bar band who might have a guitar player that has chops like Joe Satriani, and they're out there, by the way, but never recorded or uploaded any material, they might be underrated, right? Never been given a chance to be heard by an appropriate audience. That's the key. Another scenario, the drummer who can play along note for note with Dream Theater's catalog, no easy thing to do there, but who never leaves her garage might be underrated. Again, never given an appropriate chance, a chance for an appropriate audience to hear them. The songwriter whose lyrics are solitary journals and proclaims himself a cross, say, between Lou Reed, Iggy Pop, and Alice Cooper, wouldn't that be something? May also be underrated, right? Because they're just solitary journals, right? Most significantly, there are probably thousands, millions maybe, who would know, right, of heavy artists who do put their material out there in hopes of being heard by appropriate listeners, but who are buried in the massive labyrinth of information, vying for attention on every search engine and social media outlet. No doubt many of these could be underrated as well, okay? Because they've never got the chance to be heard by an appropriate audience. That's the essence of, I think, being underrated. Okay, so while I am sure I will continue to use terms like undervalued during, informal discourse, I'm secure in the notion that the heavy bands I personally enjoy are actually not underrated in any meaningful way, right? However, the situation is different for the countless artists that we heavy fans will never be given a fair chance to hear, right? Indeed, these are the ones we should be concerned about and or should anonymously salute for pursuing their art in obscurity. All right, and that's the series. Again, I can't thank you enough if you've checked out any of this. I really appreciate it. I hope you got something out of it. And I'll probably see you again sometime down the line. Take care.